So now I want to talk about emerging infectious diseases, and this is a quote from 1962, which essentially says that the future of infectious diseases is to be rather dull. Well, clearly we know that that's not the case. We have HIV now, we have Ebola, we have a variety of other infectious diseases that we did not have back in 1962. Actually, since 1975, there has been over 30 new diseases discovered, and most of which have been viruses. And the reason for that is that viruses are viewed as masters of interspecies navigation, meaning they move very nicely from one species to another. And these new viruses tend to come from other species, and this is referred to as zoonosis, which I'll define in a moment. Some examples of interspecies related diseases or zoonotic diseases would be Ebola, HIV, and avian flu. So what is zoonosis? It is a disease or infection that's naturally transmitted from a vertebrate animal to humans or vice versa. And at present, there are over 200 recognized zoonotic diseases, and they come in the form of bacterial, parasitic, viral, fungal, as well as other forms. So what's going on? Archaeological evidence suggests that small nomadic human groups didn't suffer from contagious diseases. But with the advent of agriculture and domestication of animals that's brought humans in closer contact with the animals and animal waste, we're now seeing more and more infectious diseases. And according to the WHO, the chief risk factor for emerging infectious diseases or zoonotic diseases is environmental degradation by humans specifically. However, there are other factors at play as well, including global climate change, travel, and industrialization of animal production. So as I speak about emerging infectious diseases, I'm going to talk specifically about bird influenza or avian influenza and then swine influenza. Specific to avian influenza, the natural reservoir is the wild duck, and avian influenza has led to numerous epidemics in poultry and other bird populations, largely driven by a dense population of birds and unsanitary and stressful conditions of those birds. We've seen an increase in the number of bird flu epidemics in the past decades. However, most avian flu strains do not jump from birds to humans. Now, the avian influenza is an RNA virus comprising two different enzymes, the hematogluten and the neuraminidase, which help make up the naming structure. And they're 16 and 9 respectively. As you can imagine then, the number of combinations of these enzymes can lead to various numbers of strains. Historically, there have been several different types of avian flus, going back to the early 1900s with the Spanish flu, as that was associated with H1N1. That killed over 1 million people. And then up until the most recent past, in 1968, was the Hong Kong flu, and that's where we saw the first time we saw the H3N2 strain, which is the common strain today that is known to affect humans at a large number. Fortunately, doesn't confer a high mortality rate. But the avian flu that we're most worried about now is the H5N1, and it was first found in 1997 in Hong Kong when there were thousands of chickens in farms that were dying from this type of the flu. And around the same time, there was a young boy who died of multiple organ failure, and his flu was typed to be H5N1. And then a smattering of other individuals subsequently became sick and died. That then led Hong Kong to order a slaughter of more than 1 million birds, and unfortunately the human transmission ceased. But in 2004, there was another widespread outbreak of H5N1 in chicken flocks throughout 8 countries in Asia, and evidence of a more virulent strain that was occurring. And then 2 years later, there were more human cases, 263, for which 60% died. And there was no evidence at the time of any transmission from human to human. And then there were subsequent outbreaks in 2007, 8, and 9. This illustrates the cases and the mortality for the H5N1 influenza from the beginning in 2003 through 2016. And while the number of cases is numerically low, the mortality rate of approximately 53% is high, and actually the highest that we've seen for a modern day influenza. This just illustrates the distribution of H5N1 in poultry and in wild birds, illustrating a vast distribution of this virus across different countries and regions. And then this illustrates the cases of avian influenza, which is obviously associated with the distribution of the poultry. So where does your chicken come from, and why is this of worry? Well, since 1969, there's been a dramatic increase in the production of chicken, and that's largely being done in China. This just illustrates a typical outdoor poultry market in an Asian country, and it essentially shows the cramping of the chicken as well as the interaction between humans and chickens. But we also see that in countries such as the United States in poultry farming, and this illustrates again mass crowding of the poultry and clearly environments for which transmission of a virus can be spread rather easily. In 2013, so kind of right in the middle of that H5N1 pandemic, the USDA allows for chicken that's grown in the United States to be shipped to China for processing and then back to the United States for consumption, which is felt to be one of the factors that could have been contributing to the movement of the H5N1 strain across countries and continents. And then this illustrates in 2005, again, kind of in the middle of that pandemic period of global poultry density. And then this is a map of predicted H5N1 infections as a function of that global poultry distribution, and then with global poultry restrictions, and depending on the restriction. And essentially it shows that if there are no trade restrictions, there would be a massive spread of H5N1. Now, it's important obviously to prevent H5N1 in poultry so that poultry themselves are not slaughtered unnecessarily. However, there's also concern about its spread to pigs because pigs are viewed as the mixing vessel for influenza viruses. That is, pigs can get infected with human, avian, and swine strains of the flu, and then this can lead to genetic ressortment, which is essentially the mixing of different strains of the flu to create a new form. And then there's clearly exposure of swine or pigs to humans, and then there's an economic impact as well. So not only is there concern about the spread of H5N1 in poultry, but also the jumping of that H5N1 strain from one animal to another. So then I want to talk now about swine flu. And here the natural reservoir is the swine. It's led to epidemics in swine as well as other species. And interestingly, up until recent, the swine flu has varied genetically between the North America and Europe. And most swine influenza strains were not known to jump from swine to humans, and hence very rarely caused human infections. There is a long history of H1N1. It's the swine flu strain in swine, but it was viewed as very stable. And really the only reported case of a human infection with swine flu was back in 1976 with one event occurring. So up until recently, there wasn't any concern about H1N1 in humans, and that changed in 2009. Basically, H1N1 is viewed as a novel influenza A virus. It had never been identified in humans. And this novel H1N1, now that it's been genotyped, is shown to have segments from both North American and European genotypes. There is evidence of human-to-human transmission with H1N1, as I'll discuss in a moment, and no proof of transmission from swine to person. Fortunately, this form of the flu doesn't confer high mortality, but it does confer high morbidity, and it's easily transmitted from human to human, and hence confers a larger overall total case count. So how did it form, or began, I should say? In 2009, the first reported case was of a young boy in Mexico, and then subsequent to that, there were future cases in Mexico and also in California, but in 2009, the CDC and others were still not able to type this type of the flu in human populations. And then between April and August of 2009, there was a massive increase in the transmission of H1N1 in humans, and this figure illustrates that. There were over 209 cases in just a 5-month period, and it jumped from country to country. Fortunately, again, it has a very low mortality rate associated with it, but the fact that it spread so easily is of concern and was a new strain and clearly a concern to public health officials. And this just illustrates, again, the concern of global migration and travel and how it can affect transmission of an infectious disease. This is a paper published in New England Journal illustrating between April 2009 in the top and late July of 2010 in the bottom, the dramatic change in the overall number of positive H1N1 samples collected among humans. So in summary, I would like to provide just a general comparison of the H5N1 and the H1N1 flu strains. So again, H5N1 is a form of an avian flu. It was first found in 1997 in Hong Kong in a poultry farm, and it subsequently spread throughout Asia and parts of Africa rather quickly. Fortunately, there's no evidence of human-to-human transmission. It's still only transmitted from birds to human, but it does confer a high mortality rate of as high as 50% or higher. And it's still circulating today, and public health officials are regularly monitoring for the presence of H5N1 in humans. H1N1 is a form of a swine flu. It began in 2009 in North America, and it quickly spread across the globe in less than 5 months. Fortunately, it confers low mortality. It's still circulating. Along with H3N2, H1N1 is the other form of flu that typically affects humans. I want to briefly talk about entogenetic shift and drift. I mentioned this before when I was referring to the swine as the source for resortment. But what this is the idea that 2 or more strains of the flu, in this case, enter a mixing vessel, and then there's some sort of resortment occurring, leading to the release of a new virus that could be capable of cross-species transmission. This is of greatest concern from a public health perspective in terms of trying to monitor and prevent flu pandemics. So in summary, big considerations for pandemic influenza include the fact that the influenza can have different origins, that there are influenza pandemics still occurring in different species, and as recent as 2009, the world experienced a new form of the flu which circulates today. We're always worried about if we have adequate supplies of antiviral medicine as well as vaccines, and just by the way, the currently approved antiviral medications are only effective for treating the more mild form of the flu. We have nothing to treat severe flu. And then humans have no immunity to the flu. That is, one can suffer from an infection in one season and then subsequently become reinfected in the next. And then there are always concerns about the economic and social implications of another pandemic flu.